Life changes in an instant. One moment you're fine, the next, someone else's negligence has turned everything upside down. And when that happens, you need fighters in your corner. NACE Law Group has been standing up for DC families for decades, taking on medical malpractice, wrongful death, and serious injury cases that others won't touch. While other firms rush to settle, NACE fights for maximum compensation. They know your family deserves justice, and they won't stop until you get it. If you or a loved one has been hurt by someone else's mistake, don't wait. Call NACE Law Group today. Visit nacelawgroup.com. That's NACE lawgroup.com.
Today on CityCast DC, what do you do when people start dumping trash in your neighborhood? It turns out no one's quite sure, including the city government that's supposed to act as watchdog. Sloane Airey wrote a wild story for City Paper about one Northeast DC neighborhood, and she's here to tell us about it. Today is Thursday, September 18th. I'm Michael Schaefer, and here's what DC's talking about. Hey, Sloane.
Hi, how are you?
I'm good. So listen, there's been a lot of talk these days about beautifying DC. Most of that talk seems to focus on Donald Trump's limo rides between the White House and various places he actually goes. You wrote about a place that I'm pretty sure he doesn't go, which has been a dumping ground, like literally, for like 40 years. Can you set the scene for us? Where in the city is this happening? What's the neighborhood like?
Absolutely. We're talking about the Woodridge neighborhood in Northeast, and I would eat my hat if Trump has ever heard of it. Never mind. Been through it. For those of you who are a little more local, you might have driven around it. Woodridge is right on the Maryland border, northeast of DC. And the very specific area that we're talking about is the 3,000 to 3,100 blocks of Monroe Street. Monroe is, if you can picture this, it's right downhill from the super busy Newton Street northeast, and it's sandwiched, if you will, between Rhode Island Avenue and Bladensburg Road.
And who lives here? What are the demographics of the neighborhood?
Woodridge is historically a Black neighborhood in DC. And like most Black neighborhoods in DC, it's also had its fair share of changes over the last couple decades as gentrification has swept in, and with that brought a lot of new home buyers as the existing home buyers, many of them have aged out and sold. But I would say it's still very mixed. You will still find some real Washingtonians there, some real characters, and the new neighbors as well. I think one of the things that makes Woodridge special is the new neighbors are also very invested in the neighborhood. They also really care about it. They are there to put down roots. They're not there to, say, Airbnbify their houses.
So one thing that hasn't changed with the demographics is that stuff keeps getting dumped there. What exactly is it, and where is the dumping happening?
This is wild. Honestly, unpacking this is wild. Can I start with how I found out? Because I've been in DC for going on 10 years, and I like to think that I've been around to the wards and stuff. I personally had never heard of this before the story. So if I may.
No, you should. And because it's relevant, not just if you care about Woodridge or happen to live there, but what I got out of your story was a metaphor for how hard it is for any citizens to get chronic filth taken care of.
It is. And I'm not going to incredible depth in this interview, but for anyone who is really interested in this kind of story, this is one particular neighborhood with one particular alley really in the neighborhood. Like, we're zooming in that tight of a detail. But truthfully, there are problems echoing in other neighborhoods across DC that are very similar to this. So if this is a story that interests you or really gets you fired up, there's a lot of opportunities to get involved in the other neighborhoods too that are affected by these kind of things. And to that point, one of the reasons that Mitch at the City Paper reached out to me is I think because he realized not only was this a crazy story in and of itself, but it was emblematic of some of these larger issues facing a whole ton of neighborhoods. So we're really going to talk about one here. But again, this is definitely a more widespread network of issues. So that being said, Mitch reached out to me in, I think it was March, and he said, I have this email from an ANC, an advisory neighborhood commissioner, and it's saying some really wild stuff about this one alley behind a few people's houses way out in Northeast. And I said, that's usually the kind of pitch a news site wouldn't take or a newspaper wouldn't necessarily put at the top of their queue, and certainly wouldn't be sending freelancers out for. So I was curious to learn more. What would make Mitch Riles want to send me, a freelancer, out to do a story about some alley? There's lots of alleys in DC.
I got to say, as a Washington City Paper veteran, that's an old school City Paper story. We did a lot of random stuff in one alley over the years.
Which is also, as a side note, a reason I really like City Paper. This is work and it needs to be funded. So that's my plug for local news aside. Mitch reached out to me in March and he says, go check out this alley. And I was skeptical, but I was like, you know what? Mitch has a great eye for news. City Paper is home for weird stuff. Let's do it. I reached out to the ANC representative. Then I connected with some neighbors and they were really gracious. The others had never heard of me, didn't know this was happening. I just knocked on their door. I had like boots covered in mud from trapezing through this alley behind their house. When I arrived there, it became clear how bad this problem was. And part of the severity was that it's not just one issue. So there's this wonderful alley. It's really pretty. I'm so glad I went to understand how pretty this really is. It stretches behind all these houses on these couple blocks on Monroe Street Northeast. And it's shadowed by these trees. It's really shady in the hot summer sun. It's kind of woodland, very magical. I saw a fox, there's a bunch of birds. It's very nice. What makes it not nice is everything else about it. One of the issues is the dumping of trash. People have treated this alley like a community dumping station, like some kind of transfer station for decades. I found out by knocking on doors, even people who wouldn't sit for a full interview would just give me a couple like pieces of info and stuff. And I traced it back to, I think it was 42 years. I had people saying that they've been working on the trash dumping issue. And I want to be like totally clear with people listening to this who maybe haven't read the story. This is not the case of someone who just drops a Cheeto bag as they're walking at night on their way home. This is not that kind of trash. This is garbage bags that are full of construction debris from construction sites. And if you've been around construction sites, if you worked on them, there's a lot of debris involved in cleaning up at the end. And it has to be disposed of properly, and that can be expensive. Well, people have been taking shortcuts by just throwing that in this alley, throwing it on the embankments that surround the alley that are covered in those nice trees. Again, I stepped through just sedimentary layers of like kitchen tile and drywall.
So wait, it's all construction detritus?
It's not all construction detritus. I think that's the one that stood out to me first because of the layers of it. Clearly, it had been happening for such a long time. Previous to me coming, the neighborhood actually had gotten together and had done a huge pickup day. They made it a whole weekend event with as cozy and as friendly as you can make it. But they were actually hauling out, in addition to construction debris, appliances. They were hauling out large amounts of trash. I think they told me it was more than 7 wheelbarrows of straight up trash. And then plus they needed to rent some kind of vehicle for disposing all of the actual fridges. We're talking microwaves, huge stuff, weird stuff, things that I was really mystified. Why would you think to put a fridge in your car and drive it down to some random alley in Woodbridge and throw it in?
Well, I think I know the answer to that, which is that you don't want to have to pay to take it to a real dump.
Right.
Did you know that the Library of Congress is free and open late on Thursdays? Live at the Library connects you to library collections and elevates happy hour in one of DC's most gorgeous spaces with eclectic live entertainment. Seriously, they've even hosted circus performers from Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey. Check out loc.gov/live, and you'll find a costume party, a film screening of All About Eve with Bette Davis, throwing all the withering barbs, pop science author Mary Roach, and SNL alum Kate McKinnon. And that's just in the next couple weeks. Discover what Live at the Library has in store for you and your next night out. Visit loc.gov/live to see upcoming events and register for free tickets. For nearly 40 years, Food and Friends has delivered hope and health across the DC region with home-delivered, medically tailored meals for neighbors living with serious illnesses like HIV/AIDS, diabetes, cancer, and more. This October, you can be part of that mission by joining Move for Meals, a month-long fitness and fundraising challenge. Walk, run, or bike wherever you are. Track your time exercising via the fitness app Strava and raise funds for neighbors in need. Every $10 you raise provides one medically tailored meal, ensuring that more people facing serious illnesses receive the nutrition that they need to heal. Help us reach our goal of 20,000 meals. Sign up today at p2p.onecause.com/moveformeals or visit foodandfriends.org and help us deliver hope and health one meal at a time. This podcast is brought to you by Wise, the fastest and most affordable way to use your money around the globe. With Wise, you can send, spend, and receive up to 40 currencies with only a few simple taps, and save up to 55% compared to major banks. Plus, Wise won't add hidden fees to your transfer. Whether you're buying souvenirs with pesos in Puerto Vallarta or sending euros to tip your Colosseum tour guide, you know you're getting a fair exchange rate with no extra markups. Wise offers 24/7 live support and runs over 7 million daily checks to catch and prevent fraud, so you know your money is where it's supposed to be. Be smart. Join the 15 million customers who choose Wise. Download the Wise app today or visit wise.com/US/compare. Terms and conditions apply.
So before we get to like what the neighbors did themselves to try to clean this up and what they tried to get their government to do for them, based on your reporting, what was the genesis of this? Like 42 years ago, someone discovered there's this alley where there's houses on one side but not on the other, and you can throw stuff without anybody catching you. Do we know like how that came about?
No one had a really specific, like, oh, it was the summer of, 60 something where this started. I think that the story of this neighborhood, this is built in the 1920s. It's built, by the way, we'll get to that later, but it's built in an area where it shouldn't have been built, just geographically speaking. But it's built in the 20s and it's a working class neighborhood. I think that it's a neighborhood that hadn't seen a lot of investment from the city. I think it's a neighborhood that hadn't certainly seen a lot of care and attention from city agencies, I think it's fair to say. And people had been used to just like doing stuff themselves if they wanted anything done. And at some point when you have a really secluded alley, like I need readers and listeners to picture this is way more secluded than a typical alley that you have in DC between like, a bunch of row houses going down. No, this is, you feel like you're in the woods. You don't feel like you're in DC. That, and knowing that neighborhood is built between a bunch of other neighborhoods that probably were being built right after that, right around that time. That's a ton of construction. It's not a watchful eye from the city. It's neighbors who are working very hard, the working class people. They probably don't have a lot of time to overextend in policing their own alley, at that point.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I think plenty of people who work really hard are very zealous about making sure their own neighborhood stays clean. I think what's different in this place is just literally the number of human beings who live within eyesight of what this is going on. It's not that many. So that just lowers the percentage of chance that someone's going to see you dumping your refrigerator there.
I think so. And I also think, this is not a thing that I was able to speak with some of the older folks just because some of them preferred not to sit down for an interview. But if I were to hazard a guess here, we're talking about a neighborhood in the 20s and then going up to around the 60s. This is a historically Black neighborhood as well. I can't imagine that any requests that they were making for city involvement for help doing these kind of things maybe was not met with the appropriate attention. I can't picture a Black neighborhood in DC in this era getting its due flowers for people who are working hard. I think that there's a difference, and one of the neighbors pointed this out in the interview. He said something like, we know that if it was a Northwest problem, it would be solved. And I think that there's a truth element to that. It's not that people in Northwest don't also work really hard. But I think that when the city works with you, you can accomplish so much, right? Instead of working against you.
So can you give me some examples of the city not working with people? I mean, people clearly, there's people who run for advisory neighborhood commission. There's people who organize block parties. These folks reached out to the government, said, hey, can you please do something to put a stop to this? And were unsuccessful. What happened? Who dropped the ball?
Yeah, one of the issues here is that, again, there's a couple different issues. Trash is one of them, but it's not the only one. And whenever you have a multidisciplinary issue in DC or any city, you're talking about multiple different agencies that you're working with. To explain this, I think we have to talk about the water. And then I can give you really specific examples of how the city has let people down, if that's all right. Mm-hmm. So the reason I said maybe this neighborhood wasn't built at the right spot geographically is because it's actually built on top of the Hickey Run watershed system. For those who aren't familiar, DC is often called a swamp, but in reality, it's a huge tributary network of various rivers and streams and all these kinds of things, a lot of which were paved over or bulldozed or buried under construction. And in this particular neighborhood, it's very unfortunate because the city buried a stream right underneath all of these houses in 1920 when they were building this whole development. Now, the problem with burying a stream is that water wants to go where it wants to go. You can't really keep a whole stream buried like that, especially when we have the spring rains and it swells up. And so when you visit today, you will notice that there is water coming out of seemingly nowhere on the embankments of the alley, and then it disappears again. And then you see this big drain on the bottom of the slope of this alley, the lowest point, right? And the drain is always cluttered with a ton of trash, but also things like sticks and leaves. And whenever it gets too clogged up, it floods. We're not talking like, oh, get your puddle jumpers on and jump over it. We're talking huge flood. We're talking the person's yard who was adjacent right there to it. I had mud up, I think, halfway up my calves, trying to trapeze through her yard with her permission to see this. It's her entire backyard is a wetland. And that's because this isn't just a little bit of runoff water from like a city street. This is a buried stream that swells up and it floods everything. So not only is that flooding very difficult in this instance for one neighbor who has no use of her backyard because it is literally just a pit of water, but also imagining DC summers, right, DC springs, the amount of mosquitoes that you are getting in this neighborhood from all of this standing water that kind of doesn't have anywhere to go because the majority of it's been buried underground, so there's no flow. It's been chopped up in little pieces with little bits bubbling to the surface, if you can imagine that. But all those bits that bubble up to the surface, they pool, they find places to make little pools. And that's a mosquito nursery ground that DC is running.
So connect the water to the detritus.
Sure. So you now have this situation where you have a little slopey slope down this alley. You have pools of water at random spots that can't drain properly. Then you add a ton of trash to that. Now you have dirty water that is unsafe to be around. You don't know what's in the water, right? Tetanus shots abound here. You have just so many mosquitoes living in this trash and living in this water, and you can't clean it up because even if you magically get rid of all the trash, A, someone's going to dump more the next week, and B, it doesn't get rid of the water. Taking out those refrigerators doesn't fix the water problem. And this is where that conflict with the city comes in, where you said, how has the city's response been to this? The neighbors are really frustrated because they can do as many neighborhood cleanups as they want to take out all the trash. I think it's great that they did that. I think that's great civic involvement. Neighbors can't excavate a stream bed that's underneath their own houses, right?
But neighbors can certainly call the Department of Public Works, who run garbage collection, and say, this is happening. But I think what you reported was because of the water, because of this, there's some division about which agency of government would handle this. Is it Public Works? Is it the Department of Transportation? Is it Environment?
Yes, I think the trash was a little more straightforward, that it was a combination of getting some MPD patrols to make it not so easy to sneak in at night and dump huge stuff, and then also getting help physically removing what was already there. And to my knowledge, that has gone back and forth for many years. I don't know how helpful this article was, but I can tell you from talking to neighbors since it came out in April, there hasn't been trash re-added, like big bulk trash re-added to the alley, which is fantastic. And MPD had already started doing some patrols thanks to neighbors really turning up the heat on before the article came out, and that has continued since the article came out a couple months ago. So that's really great. I think the trash problem has seemingly, knock on wood here, has abated for these neighbors, which is fantastic. The stream problem has not. So the stream problem is the one being kicked around kind of like a hacky sack between a bunch of different agencies. It's really going to have to be a joint operation between DDOT, between DC Water, and Department of Health.
DDOT is the Transportation Department, and I guess they're involved because it involves a public alley.
It involves a public paved alley, and it might also affect, the street, the actual Monroe Street, or the cross streets at either end of this alley, right? All of us in DC are living with the legacy of the history of the buildings we're in, the streets we're on, and what's underneath those streets. And it's unfortunate for these neighbors that part of that legacy that they're dealing with is this huge buried waterway. So as I understand it, again, there are buried streams all over DC. This is not the only neighborhood. When this becomes a problem for a neighborhood with a buried stream, what you need to do is what's called a groundwater study. And that studies where exactly the stream is going. It compares it to historical maps of where it was before it was buried. And my understanding is the point is to start making a plan or plans of what you could do to fix this. Maybe that's excavating the stream. Maybe that's diverting it. Tons of different options. So the neighbors came together over the last year, and they've really been asking specifically the DC Department of Transportation, DDOT, to do this groundwater study. And DDOT has kept saying no. So the neighbors said, we will pay for it. We come together. We have agreed to even pay for it. We understand with hundreds of buried streams in DC, you can't fund them all, but we will expedite it by paying for it. DDOT still said no. So
What was their reason for saying no?
I don't really have a documented reason. I did reach out to them as well as the mayor's office for community relations, and I didn't really get any firm reason. To be honest, I wish I could tell you something really direct here. If I were to hazard a guess, it's a combination of they have a lot of buried streams to work through. Any city agency never has the budget it wants to do every single project, so there's an issue of triage. But I think that, again, this neighborhood has such a severe case that if triage is how we're operating in DC with these kind of projects, I really think that this neighborhood should be moved quite far up that list. And I also think it is frustrating that they offered to privately pay it in order to alleviate that cost to the city, and that was still not an option. I spoke yesterday to a couple of the neighbors just to double check, has there been any movement on this specific issue? Everyone I spoke to said no, that it's still a hacky sack issue.
So one of the things you mentioned is the neighborhood's gentrified a bit, which means that there are some people there who possibly are more accustomed to being able to exercise some power in society. And which certainly means that there are some people there who, rather than sitting on houses that have already been paid off or have, the 28-year-old mortgages, are actually sitting on new, very pricey 21st century real estate, which tends to focus the mind on maintaining your property's value. But even with this kind of landowner, that hasn't, I assume that's why they were willing to pay themselves, but it still hasn't guaranteed them any luck in terms of getting the city to dig them out.
Yeah, I think this kind of new owner is maybe exemplified in one of the folks I've named in the article's name's Joey Abrams. He was the gentleman who offered me a tour of the alley, of his property, of the area. He was very generous with his time. He's a young guy. He's got a young family. He moved in, I think, 10 years ago or so. He describes himself as he's part of the gentrifier class, right, of the area. He's white. And I think the way that he would describe it is not that he cares more than the folks who were there before him in the neighborhood, but I think he comes in with new energy versus someone who's been at this for 20 years is very worn out. Someone who comes in with new energy, new ideas is always helpful. In Joey's case in particular, he is a professional cartographer. So he was the one who helped gather, but then also describe to his other neighbors how these historic maps worked of the buried streams. He has a real understanding of how to read those kind of otherwise quite difficult to access maps. Those maps, by the way, are now also public. That's not from the article. That's a DC-wide program initiative, is to make all these historic maps public. It's really helpful for all kinds of neighbors, though. Joey's is also someone who, part of these new ideas and energy was taking the lead on using the camera rebate program in the district to set up cameras that had like motion activated lights too, and setting that up facing the alley.
And so he caught some dumpers. What did he see?
So after that, the big neighborhood cleanup, which was in the very end of March, I think, he caught a bunch of kids coming and trying to steal all of the landscaping equipment that the Department of Public Works had loaned the neighbors for the cleanup, rakes, shovels, all that kind of stuff that they had.
So that's the opposite of dumping. They were swiping.
And stealing. So that made me be like, oh, I wonder how much like theft has occurred and maybe has gone unnoticed too. In general, Joey, and now a ton of other neighbors have cameras set up. Neighbors told me in the last 2 months, way more of them on the block have put them up. They've just said that what they've noticed is there's way more traffic in this super secluded middle of nowhere alley than they realized before cameras. Because again, it's really secluded, it's really quiet. And if you're in your house, like facing forward on Monroe Street, and you're not looking at your alley, or if it's dark and you can't see, how would you know that there's a ton of people going through? But there has been. And they say that they feel a lot safer having the cameras, knowing that, as well as MPD has, as I said, continued to do those patrols. So they feel like the amount of crime going down in the alley has gone down, which I think is a peace of mind notion, as well as a deterrent, because it's a lot harder to dump in this alley.
But listen, this sounds like a big engineering project. I'm talking about the water part, not the dumping. A cynic might say, well, look, these guys, particularly the newcomers, they bought houses knowing that it's a wet place where things flood. Why should we fix it for them?
That's an interesting question. And one of the neighbors I talked to, her name is Wander Bamberg Tia. She's a real Washingtonian, lovely, generous woman with her time. She is the one who lives on really one of the most flood-affected properties in this area. And she moved in about 20 years ago. And she told me she did not know it was flooded, because the problem is if you buy at a certain time of year, let's say late fall, right before winter, that's a dry time for the neighborhood. The stream is not bubbling up and flooding everything. The ground looks very hard and looks very nice. And there isn't a requirement to disclose that you have a flooding backyard when you're selling your house. So she actually is a good example of someone who bought and had no idea this was a problem, in her words, until the spring came, and she was really excited to start hosting her family for all these reunions and these parties, and then was immediately confronted by the fact that, oh no, I can't use this house. She actually, in her case, by the way, can't even sit in the front of her yard, not because the front is also flooding, but because the amount of mosquitoes makes it unsafe to sit on her porch. I don't know how you would know that this is a problem if you bought at that time of year. There's no signs up.
So let's talk about what happens now. We're obviously in the middle of this moment where the president, for better or worse, has vowed to do all kinds of things, ethical and less so, to clean up the city. I'm curious if any of that, could we see National Guard troops out landscaping? And if not, what is realistic next steps that may happen?
That's a funny question. And I was thinking about this today because Trump had passed that executive order March, April, I think, about beautifying the district. And I wonder if there is an opportunity to use federal manpower, whether that's the National Guard, or use federal funds to do projects like a major engineering stream project of excavating something or rerouting. This is something that is going to cost tens of thousands of dollars, if not hundreds of thousands, easy. And that's on the low end of the estimates there. I don't know if that's possible. I think it would still require to work with these DC agencies. I think that kind of initiative would have to come from the DC agencies. Currently they don't seem to be working very hard, at least on this neighborhood's Berry Stream. So it's challenging to think of them going the extra mile and working with the feds, going above and beyond here. I can't picture that happening, but I would be the first one to say if it did happen, that would be fantastic. I think that would be an excellent way to quote unquote beautify DC and to make it safer, which was the other part of that whole executive order, is crime and safety. I would love to see the thousands of National Guardsmen stationed all over the district put their hands towards something that does help the district. But right now, I don't see a path forward for that particular item. But yeah, I'd love to be proven wrong.
Sloane, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me, and thanks for caring about local news and the people in DC.
Hey, if you love hyperlocal stories like this one, become a member. It's just $10 a month. You get great perks and you get moral superiority over everyone else, which doesn't hurt these days. Head to membership.citycast.fm to join. And that's all for today here on CityCast DC. If you enjoyed the show, why not tell a friend, rate the show, leave us a review, and subscribe to our morning newsletter. We'll be back tomorrow morning with more news from around the city. Bye.